Brookings Institute Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Center on the 21st Century Security and Intelligence, Michael O'Hanlon, with me now from Washington. And Michael, first to what we saw there again in Berlin. Chancellor Merkel has said that we need to assume this was a terrorist attack. But we see it, and however increasingly, an attack in a public place with an instrument that is readily available. Is talk of prevention at this point a fool's errand?
No, it's not a fool's errand, because what we know is, of course, this kind of attack was utilized in Nice last summer, and that was 5 months ago. And this is the first, 6 months ago. I'm sorry, it was 5, but this is the first time since then that we've seen it successfully used again. We know that terrorists like to copy each other. When they see a successful tactic, they think that it's smart to keep going back to that same tactic, whether with airplanes, truck bombs, improvised explosive devices, shootings in nightclubs. You know, there's only a certain number of things they can do, and they like to copycat each other, partly because that, you know, a tactic has already been proven to work, partly because it reinforces the sense of fear that now we have these 4 or 5 things that are on the minds of innocent people. But, you know, it's not that trivial for them to do it. The bad news is we can probably never prevent these things entirely, because it just takes one wayward soul. The good news is that it's pretty hard to do, and it doesn't happen very much. So our hearts go out to the German victims. But I don't think this will be successfully employed a lot, even if it could be once in a while down the road.
Now, this attack in Berlin comes at a time when tensions are extraordinarily high with regard to the refugee crisis there. In the last year alone, the country took in more than 1 million refugees, and German Chancellor, as I mentioned, Angela Merkel, who does face a re-election fight in part from a far-right anti-immigrant party, now sees this come to pass. She has said that if, in fact, the perpetrator is an asylum seeker, it will be most unfortunate. What impact would that have?
Well, first of all, I want to just say how incredibly impressed I am by the German people and by the Chancellor. You know, there is a debate, as you say. She may have gone too far for the ability of the German public to sustain this kind of generosity of spirit towards immigrants, but it's really quite stunning. 1 million people coming into Germany. This may or may not have been one of those million. We don't know. And even if it was a Muslim immigrant, there was a suspicion, as you know, that it could have been a Pakistani. You know, that kind of a person may or may not actually be part of the recent refugee flow. So we really have to wait and see. But the other thing to look at is that this is now the first successful fatal attack of a terrorist nature this year, or really ever in the modern era in Germany, from this kind of a group, at least in decades, going back to the Munich Olympics, I believe. And so, in a way, the Germans have, you could say, been lucky, or they have been vigilant, or they have been welcoming enough that most of these refugees sort of help the German authorities make sure there aren't refugees who turn into terrorists. And so whatever the system might be, and however controversial, I would say I'm impressed by it. I would say the number of attacks is very small compared to the number of immigrants. And while this is sure to intensify the German debate, we shouldn't exaggerate the problem. They've been doing extremely well at keeping their country safe, even though they've had all these refugees arrive.
If we then see the Western capitals in Western Europe become a de facto front line in the war on terrorism. We had a guest on earlier today advocating for a more proactive solution against ISIS, against al-Qaeda. He came short of saying that means more boots on the ground. But when we see what's unfolding in Syria and Iraq, need there be a more proactive stance there?
Well, it's a good question. Certainly we're making headway, and it's taken a long time. I've been a critic of President Obama's Syria and Iraq policy. I think especially the last couple of years, not so much 2016, where the momentum has been in the right direction in both countries, but until this year, the success that ISIS had in both Syria and Iraq fed into their narrative that they were establishing this caliphate. They were going to have a showdown battle with the so-called infidels, and then gradually expand their caliphate throughout the broader Middle East. That was their narrative. It's their apocalyptic vision of the future. And for a couple of years, their progress on the battlefields of Iraq and Syria and elsewhere, like the Sinai and Libya, seemed consistent with this vision. Unfortunately for them, good for us, we are starting to repudiate this vision. They are losing territory fast in both Iraq and Syria. However, there is still a residual element of anger, of frustration, of successful use of social media to recruit. They're not going to be totally defeated. And therefore, I think we have to recognize there are going to be these sort of attacks every so often, and we're just going to have to wrestle with it. Frankly, I actually think most citizens understand this pretty well. And sometimes in our media and our think tank and our political debates, we exaggerate or get too caught up in the latest news. I think most citizens know this is the sort of thing you have to ride out. And yes, you look for better solutions, but it's part of reality. And by the way, it's a relatively modest threat to the average person in their daily lives. So I'm not going to say that the cities of Europe are becoming the front lines in some great new battle. I don't think that's accurate. I think that they are seriously at risk of occasional attacks. And for that reason, I would agree with your earlier guest. We need to keep doing better in Iraq and Syria. But I think the momentum is starting to develop on our side.
Well, I also want to ask you about the assassination of the Russian ambassador in Turkey. As talks between the two countries were expected to begin as they look to negotiate some sort of peace agreement in Syria, how do you see that act impacting those talks?
Well, as you know, while I don't want to in any way trivialize the assassination, and I'm very sad for the individual who lost his life and his family, the Russians have been using brutal tactics in Syria. And you can understand the anger of some people, not to justify the assassination, obviously. But nonetheless, this kind of thing, this spillover from the Syrian civil war, may continue even longer than ISIS is able to hold on to cities like Mosul in Iraq or Raqqa in Syria. Because the way in which President Assad of Syria and the Russians and Hezbollah and others are gaining battlefield success in Syria is through these brutal, heinous attacks that are causing huge numbers of civilian casualties. And President-elect Trump is going to have to be wary of hooking his wagon too closely to the Russians and the Syrian president in how we try to end this war. We need a more sophisticated way than just bombing ISIS and al-Qaeda into oblivion, because you generate the basis for future extremist movements and these kinds of actions when you do that. So that does get back to your earlier debate about the future of our Syria policy. I do think we're going to have to think hard about that. I've been doing some writing on that. It's a whole separate subject. Well, it's a linked, related subject. It's a big subject, but I think you're right to call attention to that.
Well, then what do you make of, frankly, what many see as the disingenuousness on the part of Russia as it looks, along with Iran and Turkey, for the negotiation of peace in a country whose brutal regime Russia has propped up for years and whose president has called Donald Trump a natural ally?
Well, yeah, Russia has been cynical about its Syria policy, and they have never been serious about the peace negotiations to the extent those were about creating a new government. However, I will give Russia a little bit of deference. We haven't been, in the sense that we haven't been very clear or effective in our policy either. And at least Russia sort of knows what it wants. Now, I'm not going to defend any of its battlefield tactics. We have been far better in the use of force. However, the Russians have been consistent. They think that Assad is the least of all the plausible evils, and holding him up is both a way to reestablish Russian power and influence, but also to defeat extremists. So their vision, their theory of the case, at least has a certain self-consistency to it. But we need a negotiated settlement that doesn't require the Sunni Muslims to live under Assad again. That's going to require either confederation, some other form of self-governance, or, in a Hail Mary, getting Assad to step down. But I think the Hail Mary is pretty unlikely. So we're going to need some kind of devolution of power to the Sunni Muslim areas where this war is not going to end and the terrorism is not going to end.
Michael O'Hanlon, on a number of subjects, your insights very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.